Okay, so here's our puzzle. Right? How to think this idea, right? How to think being, right, beneath identities, and to think that being beneath identities that can generate and is perpetually capable of generating, right, new identities, right, which are, right, the product not of opposition or negativity, right, but simply of a positive creativity, an active creativity.
It's just the word positive that puzzles me.
We can just think
Creative. It's not. It's something.
it's creative. It's I was positive as opposed to negative. It's not the labor of the negative. Right. And here is where he says, now there's the quote, right? Right. What do we find behind everything? What generates? Right. It's difference in itself. Right? Now again, I want to leave this as a bit of a placeholder. Right. So, but whatever it is that which generates identities, which is itself not an identity and does not involve any identities. If we fail to recognize difference in itself as that which can create, that which is always available to create, then one way or another we're going to find ourselves back either in the primacy of identity or in the labor of the negative. So our relation to this thing that generates, if we are to avoid falling back into identities, which are secondary, right, or falling back into reactivity, is, right, now, Mila, we have to affirm, right? We affirm difference, right, at the price, right, of the failure happening at the price of falling back into identities, right, and epiphenomena, right, or going into reactivity. Let me put this. I want to put this thought then another way. That's going to step back from the immediacy of the thought, but just so you can see from another angle what he's on about. What Deleuze is after here, and what he's trying to touch on, what we're just beginning to touch on here, is to think of the world, of being, of what there is, not in, we could say, either conservative or reactive terms, but in, and this is a term he uses for all his favorite philosophers, what he calls joyous terms.
Joyous terms.
Joyous terms, right? That is to say, we see being as an eternal source of creativity. Whatever there is, right? There's always more that we don't know. Right? Whatever identities have been generated, others can be generated, and they're not generated by opposing identities that are there. They're generated by investigating what else can be expressed. One of his favorite quotes was from Spinoza. Right? Spinoza said, "We don't yet know of what a body is capable." What Deleuze is getting at here is that whatever we experience, whatever appeared, whatever's created, there is always more. And we don't know what that more is unless we investigate. But if we don't affirm that there's always more, if we are content to say that all that there is what appears appears to us, and if we insist that all there is what appears to us and there's nothing more, then we are in the position, Mila, of the politician. That's the politician, right? Right, the one who says, what there is all that there is, right? There's nothing more. Right? In contrast to the poet, who always is asking, what more is there to be created? But the poet, in order to ask that question, has to presuppose that being has not been exhausted, right? That there's experimenting to be done, that there's creation to be had, or to put it in Deleuze's terms, beneath the realm of identity, or the identities that present themselves, there is a realm that generates them and can generate other things, that is to say, a realm of difference. Right. Now, we'll come back. Right. We're beginning to touch on difference itself, right? And part of seeing it is in contrast to the term identity. Right? That if identities are what is created, what will we call the thing that creates them? Right? Well, it can't have any identities, right? It can't be a difference between identities. So it's got to be something, right? And this idea of difference in itself is that thing we can't put into a category of a particular identity, because otherwise we've defeated the whole point, right? All right. So the term he gives to it is difference in itself, right? Sometimes he uses other terms, but here it's fundamentally different. Right? Sometimes he's used the term multiplicity in some of his later works, right? But here the term difference in itself, right? So you can see what the motivation is for using the term for that thing, right? And then when you ask what that thing is, it's really going to be difficult to get at, because any way of talking about what that thing is going to put it back into an identity, isn't it? Right? So.
Can I ask you something?
Yeah.
So,
wait. Let me one more thing. Wait, because I want to say that's because I want to bring back to a quote. Right. That's when he says that the being of the sensible can only be sensed. It can be sensed. We can get a sense of it, but we're not going to be able to categorize it. The being of the sensible can only be sensed. Okay, show me.
The being of a sense.
Of the sensible, of what appears, right?
Mm-hmm.
The being, back to I think the being of the aesthesis, right, can only be sensed. It
That's
cannot
what
be
he
had.
writes, the logic of sense.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Show me.
excuse me, but so that thing that we cannot define,
Mm-hmm.
Deleuze defines this as difference. So the things we
Yeah.
don't know is difference.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Right. Yeah. I'm gonna make the language a little more precise. Right. The term that he uses for that thing we cannot define is difference in itself.
Is
Right. Difference in itself. Right. But
I didn't heard the word. This poetic way of thinking, was it joyous?
oh yeah. It's
Gilles.
As a
Gilles.
J-O-Y?
Joyce.
E-U-S.
E-
Joyous.
But
no,
in English,
joyous.
O-U-S, right?
Yeah.
Joy.
Thank you.
Joyous.
Yeah. Yeah.
Gilles.
Yes.
And he refers to Spinoza also, because Spinoza in 1666 wrote the only two fundamental feelings, sadness and joy.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote that in the
Right. And Spinoza's project was how to generate joyous affects.
Yeah.
Right. Not sad affects.
Thank you.
And the picture that Deleuze is beginning to put in front of us is one in which what there is being, right, is fundamentally a source that allows for creativity. And if it allows for creativity not through the negative, right, not through saying what there is all there, what appears is all there is, right, he thinks of this as a joyous thought. And so he thinks of Nietzsche as a joyous thought. But that joyous thought, and here's where it talks about the beautiful soul, and I were talking a bit about before. The term beautiful soul is a Hegelian reference. Hegel has a category of the beautiful soul, right? And the beautiful soul affirms everything that is. And he says Nietzsche is, whatever he is, he's not a beautiful soul. Right? Because he doesn't affirm appearances. It's not fundamentally appearances that he affirms. Right? It's the being of the appearances that allows for other appearances. Right? The beautiful soul, we could say, stops at appearances. Right? Whereas Nietzsche sees beneath the appearances to affirm that out of which those appearances arise. Right? Which means he affirms that which can allow the creation of other identities, other appearances. But what this means is that as history moves forward, the potential for creativity also has to move with it. In other words, being generates identities. But if being generated identities, or difference generates identities, let's put it that way. Difference generates identities. But if difference generated identities and then exhausted itself in those identities, there would be no more foundation for creativity. So whatever identities appear, they still have to have, right, coiled within them,
They still
Right.
have to have what?
coiled inside them, right, as it were, right, difference, right. So every identity has to contain the possibility of new identities. You can't say which ones, right, because they'd be already identities, right. But every identity has to have the possibility of new identity. So it's the picture you don't want to have is that we start with difference. Difference expresses itself in the form of identities. Right? And now you have identities and no more difference. Right? Rather, right, difference expresses itself in identities. That's right. That's true. Right? But those identities, those field of identities carry difference with it.
So you say every identity has to contain the possibility for difference. You say that?
I'm going to put it slightly differently. Every identity contains the possibility for other identities. But the reason it contains the other possibility for other identities is because it contains difference. Right? So it doesn't contain just the potential for difference, it actually contains difference. Difference is still there. Right. To see this, right, think back to the example that I used last time, and some of you were here last time, some of you weren't, so just revisit the example quickly. I talked about the example of the development of the human brain. Right? So when you're a kid, right, I mean when you're an infant or the brain is undeveloped, right, the brain, through various habituations, develops particular identities. Right? So as you habituate, the synaptic connections form, and then the myelin sheath around it, right, gets harder. Right, and then you become this person, right? Now, that's, in Deleuze's view, it's an example of the realm of difference operating. Now, that difference isn't just anything. Right? The human brain can't become just anything, but we don't know what it can become. It's potential for all kinds of things. And eventually we'll get to this difference between the possible and the real on the one hand, and the actual and the virtual on the other, and I'll press on that thought a little bit more. Right? But that the brain becomes something, but whatever it becomes, it can become something else, right, through other forms of habituation, and we don't know what that other thing is that it can become. Right? Or to put that now in the terms that we've been using today, right? The identity of the brain. That identity contains within it difference that can, right, emerge, be expressed in other ways of being who you are than the way in which you happen to be now. Which means difference is always, through time, difference is always carried forward. Right? We could put this thought another way, right? That whatever identities appear, right, those identities come and go, right? But difference remains. There's always difference. I'm going to put that thought a third way and then a fourth. Right? Right. The third way is to say, right, that difference is always with us and in front of us. It keeps coming back, right, with every change of identity.
It's just the one in front of us.
It's always in front of us, right?
My brain, you know, is
Right.
it's a little bit thinking in categories, or you know, it's in front of us.
Yeah, it's always
As
there.
a possibility, it's always there.
Yeah. Right. We can use the word possibility for now. Eventually, we're going to get rid of the term possibility, but for now, that's going to be fine. Right. Right. Okay. So here's the fourth way of putting it. Right. Right. That difference eternally returns.
Yeah.
Right. Difference eternally returns. In one formulation, Deleuze puts it. There's Deleuze on Nietzsche. Remember, Nietzsche is the thinker of the eternal return. Right? That the way Deleuze puts it, right, is Nietzsche's thought is the eternal return of the same. That's what Nietzsche said, right? The eternal return of the same, right? But the same which returns is difference, right? So the eternal return of the same is the eternal return of difference itself. That is the thing that returns, right? That is the same thing that returns. The identities all change, right? But difference is the thing that keeps returning. So he says, right? So Deleuze says, for Nietzsche, right, the eternal return is of the same, but the same, right, that returns is that which differs, right? Because identities come and go. Right, and therefore the eternal return is said of that same thing which always returns, which is difference itself. Do you want to move? I know the sun is kind of funny. Rita, you okay with this? Yeah. And so Deleuze then interprets Nietzsche's thought of the eternal return, right, as a thought of although Nietzsche said it's the eternal return of the same. He thinks, no, it's the eternal return of difference. Now, let me just ask, just to do a bit of background, right? Are people familiar with Nietzsche's thought of the eternal return? Or should I say a bit about that? Rita, no, not so much. Okay, let me say a bit about that, okay? It's a very vexed doctrine in Nietzsche. Partly because he's vexed, difficult to figure out, right? I mean, partly because he seemed to have two very distinct doctrines, right? We could say one is broadly ethical and one is ontological, okay? Deleuze is picking the ontological one, right? But let me just say what the ethical one is. So when he's talking about the eternal return as an ethical doctrine, the idea is this. When you act, ask yourself the question. Let's suppose I had to live my life over and over and over again. Right? Would I do this act? Is this act worthy of being done over and over and over again? And for Nietzsche, right, the idea behind this is that if you were to ask what he called the test of the eternal return, right? If you were to ask yourself, which acts would I be willing to do over and over again? You would only choose the really worthy ones, right? Not the petty ones, right? So, and this sort of leads you toward, Nietzsche thinks, toward a more active existence, right? Do the things which are going to be creative, right? Don't do the backbiting of your colleagues thing. You know, if the backbiting the colleagues thing, if you were asked the question, look, suppose you had to do it like again an infinite number of times, do you really want that, right? So, Rita, on the one hand, right, the thought of the eternal return is an ethical doctrine, and it appears that way in Nietzsche. But there are these moments in Nietzsche where he seems to say, no, things do eternally return. Like seems doesn't mean an ontological doctrine. It's not a doctrine of a test of how to think about your own action. But there are these moments in Nietzsche, particularly some of his notebooks, right, where he just seems to say, the eternal return happens. That everything does come back. And when Deleuze is taking it up, he's taking up the ontological doctrine.
Isn't Zarathustra?
Was it?
Also sprach Zarathustra. So this one is talking about it as an ontological doctrine.
Yes, as an ontological doctrine. Right? That's to say, what comes back, what recurs is difference. Difference does recur. That is the being that recurs. Yeah.
Yeah, but I'm just talking about the book, Nietzsche's book.
Oh, Nietzsche's book.
Also sprach Zarathustra.
Oh,
About the birds and the snakes and the
that I think is where the ethical doctrine
Okay.
is. It's the will. In English, there's a collection called The Will to Power, right? Which is a collection of a bunch of his notes, and that's where the ontological doctrine. I don't recall the ontological doctrine in Zarathustra.
No, it doesn't matter.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I know the ethical doctrine's there. I don't recall the
I
ontological
think
doctrine.
Deleuze at one point is talking about this, about how to understand that the birds and everything comes back again.
Yes.
And it is Zarathustra in some chapter, but it doesn't matter. It's
Yeah,
not important.
but what recurs are not the identities, right? What comes back is difference, right? And that's why it's an ontological doctrine. Right. Rita, does that make sense? Not yet.
Not yet.
Okay. Tell me where you feel uncomfortable.
I'm just trying to just become.
Okay. Let me ask this:
Okay.
does the idea of the eternal return as an ethical doctrine make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So what we're stuck on is the eternal return as an ontological doctrine. Yes? Fair?
Yeah.
Okay, good. No, that's fine. Right. I'm going to do Nietzsche, then Deleuze, okay? When Nietzsche says, as an ontological doctrine, that everything always returns, it sounds as though, and it's hard to interpret otherwise just looking at the text, as it meaning anything other than whatever happens has always happened, right, and always will happen. Right? That things just happen over and over and over again. Okay? That would be an ontological, it really makes sense, that would be an ontological doctrine of what is, right? So now, in looking at that, what Deleuze does is he wants to take Nietzsche's idea of creativity and think of the eternal return in terms of creativity. Right? If we look at it the way the standard reading of Nietzsche, then nothing ever really gets created, right? Or at least after a certain point, because everything just is the same thing, keep coming back. Right? So the question is, how do you get, on the one hand, the thought of the eternal return as an ontological doctrine, and on the other hand, be able to factor in the possibility of creativity? Right? Well, here's the solution, right? The solution is, if what returns is difference itself, if that's what returns, not identities, but difference itself, that means you always have the possibility of creativity, right? Because what's returning are not specific identities, right? This life, these people, right? But the difference that I said is coiled inside of it, right? And that means that that if that's what's always recurring, then there really can be creativity, because, right, we can. Right, the different can generate all kinds of new identities.
Change.
Yes, right? Better?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay. What? All right. So now we have Nietzsche's thought. Right. I want to spend a few minutes on Plato. I think that's no. One more thing with Nietzsche, and this will be quick, right? one more thing from Nietzsche. I'll do representation and repetition, right? Because after all, the book is called Difference and Repetition, right? So we should say something about repetition, right? That he remember, we're in the second chapter. The third chapter is repetition, right? Which we're skipping. We're going to skip the third chapter. But in talking about repetition and contrasting it with representation, right? Representation for Deleuze is representation. There was a presentation, and you present it again. There was an identity, and the identity reappears. So to represent something is to represent it. But he contrasts this with repetition. And here's where, remember I said the first day, when he's talking about difference, he's not talking about difference in any way you've ever thought about it. When he talks about repetition, not any way you ever thought about it, right? Repetition is contrasted with representation. In repetition, and there is repetition, what is repeated is, and here's a thought that will make eminent sense now, is difference. Right? Difference is what's repeated. Okay? The eternal doctrine of eternal recurrence is the doctrine of the eternal repetition of difference. Charlotte, say a little bit more about. I think that your eyes just went in two different directions when I said. What's that?
Well, you lost me where representation
Right.
is representation.
Good.
So the next part about
Repetition.
representation being repetition is, I got lost somewhere.
Okay, good. No,
somewhere.
representation is representation.
Yeah.
But repetition, distinct, in contrast.
Okay.
Right, that's what we got, right? Repetition in contrast to representation. Repetition is repetition, not a representation of the same, right? But the eternal return of the different. Okay? Right. That should be better, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Then you got a thought or no? It sort of looked like the wheels were turning, and yeah.
I'm just a little bit tired.
Okay, good. No, that's right. All we have to do is cover Plato. Okay. And I'm going to leave transcendental empiricism for later, because he's going to come back to that.
What did you say? Not so fast.
Oh, okay. I'm going to leave transcendental empiricism for later. Right? He comes back to that term, so we'll work with that later.
Then we can't sleep.
Right? And, the hell is it? Right. If you can't, because you're thinking about transcendental empiricism, I will be so proud of you. Right.
Okay, that's a test.
Okay, a bit about Plato. Right. Plato, he has at the end, right? And again, it seems strange, right? Because Plato certainly seems to be a thinker of identity if there ever was one, right? So why does he put him after Nietzsche, right? And the reason that he does is he thinks that Plato, on the one hand, went to help set up this whole idea of identities and the primacy of identities in ways I'll talk about. But they did open up the possibility of overturning his own thought. And that overturning happens with the idea that Plato introduces of the simulacrum. So
I was wondering The word?
The word?
Yes.
Simulacra.
Yeah.
Okay, simulacrum.
Yeah.
It doesn't get better, but
Is that?
I
Is
can
that
say it, but I don't understand.
you shouldn't understand it
Now that I know.
because we haven't talked about it yet.
Cool.
Okay. No.
Thank you.
Trust me, this is all
My
going to
friend.
work out.
Yes.
Okay. Deleuze's reading of Plato, like his reading of most philosophers, right, all enters in at an odd angle. Right? He starts with what seems to be a fairly straightforward Platonic account, and then does something right that people haven't noticed. And I've often wondered, because I'm not an expert in Plato and I'm not an expert in Kant, I'm not an expert in none of the people that he treats. Although I am told by people who know these matters, right? Plato, people who study Plato, people who study Kant, that his readings are not off the wall, right? They're strange and different, but they're not. They don't dismiss them, right? So his little book about Kant that makes Kant look as anti-Kantian, right? As one can, and as a guy I know who does it as a Kant scholar said, yeah, this is actually a pretty good book, right? So he always enters at odd angles, but this entering at odd angles is not one that I think we should dismiss, because I think there's something to these ideas, right? Okay, so Plato, right? Standard view of Plato. Right? You have the forms, the identities, right? We call it the Platonic ideas. This is a three-layered analysis, right? Right. You have the ideas. There's Plato. Okay. Or some people call it the realm of the forms. Right. You have participation. And you have the participants. By the way, this is very standard. I mean, this part of Deleuze is very standard Plato. Okay, the forms, right? Beauty itself, goodness itself, justice itself, right? Those are the forms. Right. Participation is that things participate in the form to one degree or another. I'm going to say each of them, then I'm going to give you examples, okay?
The things that participate.
No, the things that participate are the participants, right?
So what did you,
The participants engage in participation.
which is,
It is, we could say, the participation is the activity involving one, to one extent or another, in the form itself. So I'll give you an example. Right? Let's suppose we're talking about the form of beauty. Right? That a beautiful object is beautiful. Why? Because it participates in beauty. Right? It takes part in the beautiful. Right? That's what makes something, right, to one degree or another, beautiful. He says this is the second. This is the second degree. The first degree is the form itself. Right? This is the second degree. Now, this may sound weird, but think of it this way. This may make it sound a little more plausible. Right? If we are to say that an object is beautiful, like an art object, right? Doesn't that seem to presuppose, if we know what we're talking about, that we know what beauty is? Right? How can we claim that something is beautiful, and then you say, oh, really? It's beautiful? What's beauty such that that thing is beautiful? Right? Well, now you have to give an account. And of course, here's where all the Platonic dialogues go, right? Like give an account of beauty and justice, etc., etc. Right? So to presuppose that something is beautiful presupposes that you know what beauty is. And to know what beauty is to know in what manner this is beautiful. Right? I know here's what beauty is, and this is the manner in which this thing is beautiful. Put that same thought another way. Right? I know what the beautiful is. This is the manner in which this thing participates in the being of beautiful. Right? So I actually think there's a fairly straightforward thought behind this. I mean, people think of the forms as sort of, these weird things out, that in some kind of strange hyperspace or something like that. But I actually think that's a much more pedestrian way to think about all this, right? Which is that if we make a claim about something as being X, we have to know what X is, right? The essence of X. And the forms can be thought of as the essence of X, whatever it is. Beauty, justice, truth, goodness, right? That's the essence of it. And to one degree or another, something that we are claiming is beautiful, good, true, somehow, right, partakes of this essence. I think we think of it that way, then Plato begins to make more sense, right? But now, this is the traditional Platonic idea. Now, what Plato worried about was not, right, we could say, those things which aren't participants, say in beauty, or justice, but those things which were false participants. They seemed to be participants, but they weren't really. They put themselves off as participants, but that involves, we could say, a fake, an illusion.
They simulated.
Yes. Now we got. I was about to go to Anna and say the name for the things which are the false participants are simulacra.
Yes.
Simulacra are the false
Simulacra.
participants. And what he calls the method of division that Deleuze refers to, right? The method of division in Plato. We don't have to worry about how the method works. Right? Method of division was a method to separate true participants from false participants. Okay.
But how do you know that it's false or not false?
That's good. It's the method of division that's supposed to tell you, right? Now, we don't have to worry what the method of division is, right? And we may come back to that, but he uses the method of division to try to tell, here's the true participants and here's the false participants. Here are the participants and here are the simulacra, okay? So the method of division is Plato's method to distinguish the true from the false participants, right? Because Plato's worry is not things that don't participate. He doesn't care about that, right? If he's going to get at the core of things, what he's got to do is he's got to get around the illusion somehow, right? And if he's going to get around the illusion, he's got to get around all the false participants, right? So the method of division is, again, we don't have to worry how it works. It is the thing Plato uses to try to distinguish the simulacra from the true participants. Right? But those true participants, right, participate in these. Right, they participate to one degree or another in the forms. But here's where Deleuze intervenes and says, yeah, but what happens every time Plato talks about the forms? Right? Every time he talks about the ideas, what happens? And Deleuze notices, and he says in the text, he goes to myth. He never actually talks about the forms, but he goes to some form of myth. Right? There's the myth of the cave, right? There's the geometrical myth. Every time he's trying to get at forms, he goes at something that is a myth. He never goes at the thing itself. He goes to some form of myth. So, the distinction between the participants and the simulacra refers to something that always seems to be mythical. But let us suppose, then, right, that this mythical thing, right, because it's mythical, doesn't really exist. Right? Then the idea of the original and the participant, we call it sometimes the original and the copy, right? It falls apart because, right, you have no original of which they are copies. And if you don't have an original, you don't have a copy. Right? And if you don't have a copy, all you have Anna are
Simulation.
exactly. Right. Simulacra are the, we could say, the copies without originals. Right. So what generates the simulacra? Difference. Difference generates simulacra. There's no original identity, right? There's just difference generating simulacra. Right? So that's why he says Plato opens the door to anti-Platonism. Right? He opens the door to his own the overturning of his own thought. Okay? Why? How does he open it? I mean, this is not Plato. But if you said, Plato, look at what you did, Plato said, no, right? No, I didn't do that. I did this. This is what I did, right?
But he isn't a true participant.
Right? That's right. He's not a true participant because up here, where we're supposed to get original, we get myth. And if we get myth, then it opens the possibility that this simply is mythical. And if this is mythical, then we've undercut the original copy distinction. If we undercut the original copy distinction, right, then there's no copies. There's simply simulacra. Right? Simulacra generated by difference. And that's why Deleuze says, right, Plato opens the door to the overturning of Platonism. Right? This thought of identity, and this one right here, if there was ever a thought of identity, this is it. Right? Begins to undercut itself when you realize that this only gets treated in a mythical fashion. Good. We've been at this. Well, I know you guys worked all day before you, and all I had to do was teach. No, which is that's cool because that doesn't, you can see that doesn't make me tired. I could do this for 2 more hours, right? But you guys actually had to do real work, right? So, okay, so for next time, okay, we're actually gonna. I believe, and I may be wrong with this, but I believe the next 2 sections are easier. Right. I've heard that. The image of thought, this 3rd chapter, which we're going to divide into, is a treatment of the traditional image of thought, right? The thing that he's criticizing, but he's going to open up some interesting and new ways of thinking about this, right? So this is the thing he's struggling against, right? So now on our pages, then we'll get everybody else's text, right? On our pages, it's 129 to 150, I think it is. Wait a minute.
Chapter 3.
It's chapter 3. Yeah, just go to it's a bit arbitrary wherever we start. There's a paragraph ending, top of 150. We'll just end right there.
What does the paragraph
Okay.
say?
Okay, yeah. The paragraph. It's going to be about halfway through the chapter. Almost exactly halfway through the chapter. It's 3. And the end of the beginning. The end of the paragraph is with the words "figures other than those of error." And then the beginning of the next paragraph is in one way or another. I want to make sure everybody's got it. Was it? For us, it's 150.
Yeah, and this one is.
Right.
Yeah, 196
196.
in the middle.
Okay, 196 in the middle, right? And Sten, you have a third edition, right? Okay, so let's find. We'll find it. There is a couple pages before. There's a indented quote that's set. Oh, I didn't know. Are your indented quotes set off in your text? Like this? You know, okay. So indented quote about 2 pages before.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll see you.
See you, yes.
Good. Is everybody with us? Okay. We got our pages. We're good. Okay. And then we can just look if we can't find it. We'll match it up. Good. Hey, thanks for hanging for 2 hours. Right. So we'll see you next week. Yes. As long as you have a good week.
Okay, there's some red wine and some cake and candy downstairs.
Oh, sorry. We'll see you. and I'll mention, I suppose when I walk around, I need to be a little careful. I was talking to Charlotte Ahila this morning, just now, that I saw a person I took to be Charlotte riding a bicycle up this hill, right, this morning. And I saw her from the back, but then she turned and sort of looked like, I thought, and so I said, hi, right? And she said, hi, right? And then I said, I'll see you later, right? And so now I have this vision that she's like called the police, right? This guy, right? This bald guy is walking around and he's going to be looking for me. He said he would see me later, right? And I assume you have stalking laws in the same way we have, right?
She's so proud. Don't worry.
Okay. So, well, what we should do is let's review, right? We'll make sure we feel comfortable, right, with what happened last time, see if there are any questions or any thoughts about it, and then we can pick up and do this stuff. So, Benedict, you said this reading you found harder than the last reading, okay?
Yeah.
For other people, yes?
Yes.
Harder, okay. That's because I thought it was easier because I had fewer names, but that's okay, right? There are essentially two parts to this, to the reading for today. One is the critique of what he calls the image of thought, and then we're going to begin to see the part where he talks about what makes us think, right? And so I'll talk about both of those, right? But first, right, from last time, in discussing the text last time, we set it up with several thinkers, right? Aristotle, then Hegel, Nietzsche, and then finished with Plato, right? And in setting that up, we saw that both for Aristotle and Hegel, but in very different ways, that difference is reduced to identity. Right? So you have Aristotle's division right into the genera, right, the species and the individuals, right? Hey, come on in. Just doing the beginning review. So this is the genera, the species, the individuals, and the differences are the differences between them. So there's a difference between the genera and the species, between two individuals, between two species. So difference is subordinated to identity. Right? In Hegel, it works differently. We talked about the dialectic. Right? You have a situation, an opposed situation breaks out. Right? There's tension, and that's resolved, and that creates a new situation with its own tensions. But here, Hegel says it's a movement through difference, but difference is conceived as negativity or opposition. Right? So the difference so he has difference subordinated to something that is negative, as something that's opposed. Right? So the question is, can we think of difference not as something that is opposed, right, or in negative, but rather as something positive, something that's creative, right? Now, why would we want to do this? Because otherwise we remain simply stuck in the identities, right? You know, sometimes I use that phrase, like all there is what appears that there is, right? And that goes back to, Alan, you had asked a question about epiphenomenology, right? That phenomenology, as an investigation of appearances, simply stays with the appearances, and if it simply stays with the appearances, the idea is there's nothing more than what appears, and therefore, right, it simply takes into account, it can't see the possibility of the new. Right? And that led to Nietzsche, right? We talked about Nietzsche and Nietzsche's view of the eternal return. And in looking at the eternal return for Nietzsche, it's not the eternal return of the same, but the eternal return of difference, right? New things are always in front of us, right? And we talked about the idea that when there's something that is an identity, right, that identity still carries difference within it. And in carrying difference within it, right, it's always the possibility of creating something new. And we're going to see more of that, not so much next time, but the time after, when we discuss the virtual and the actual. Okay? Right, that led us finally to Plato. The reason he does Plato at the end is because he sees Plato as offering the ability to opening to overturn Platonism. How does he overturn it? He has the idea of there's the good and the things that participate in it, right? The idea of the forms, there's forms, there's participation, and the participants themselves, and that would be a very classic model, right? But when he gets to the forms, it's always a matter of myth. So one then begins to imagine participation without anything it's participating in, right? And that would be the simulacra. Okay? Now, let me ask this before we turn to anything. Questions, thoughts, anything left over that we want to pick up on, right? Or we dive into the chapter, or what? Good? Okay? Okay. Oh, one more thing I was going to bring up.
I just want
Go ahead, Charlotte.
Isn't it a bit easy for him just to quit the myth stuff, post Plato? Or
Easy for him, Charlotte, how?
It's a bit. I don't think that I can follow the arguments, but it's not that I think that it makes perfect sense in my own mind that Plato had this myth
Right.
things, but I just think that it's very easy for him to say, right, it's myth, it's only myth.
Oh, you mean for Deleuze to say that?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Good. Okay. I think I got you. Let me put it this way: that what the idea, the form is, it's the original, right? And everything copies it to one extent or another, right? So you have beauty. That would be the original. That's the essence, right? And things that participate more or less. They're more or less beautiful, right? Depending on how well these models, right, model the original. Okay? Now, question is this. Can you work out the original? Can you say what the original is, right? Well, that was always a sticking point, because when he gets to the original, he starts the myth, the hand waving, right? But if you can't work that out, maybe the copies are not copies of an original. Maybe there's no original to be copied. And so you have something that would be the first way to put it is copies without an original. But of course, you can't have copies without an original. So what do you call copies without an original? That's where the term simulacra comes from, right? Or simulacrum in a single, right? So that's that would be the copy without the original, right? It would be, I think Deleuze would say, on Plato, it would be his task to try to come up with an account of the original. But without an account, there's no reason to assume there's anything there, right? And now you have copies without an original, and that would be the move. Charlotte, is that better?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so, this is what I was going to do. Here's what I was thinking we would do. So we have, I was thinking we'd finish the chapter for next time, right? Then I've got a slightly different reading. I was going to do sort of a different reading of the virtual, the actual. Then I think there's another 2 classes after that. And I was going to come up with a reading for the first class, but I thought if people were interested, what we would do the second class, the very last session, is instead of doing a reading, come up with a series of terms that Deleuze uses, machines, rhizomes, and I could show you how they all work, right, within the context of different, how you get from difference to repetition to all these other things. Would that be? That might be better, right? Okay, so we can do that, right? And then, I've got some terms, and there may be terms that people have heard of. I've heard of, but this in Deleuze, and we can sort of spend our time sorting that out, right? Good? Yeah. Okay. All right. So now, in this chapter, the chapter has 2 different elements in it, right? One is critique, and the other is positive. And what
The other is
positive is a positive account, right? And they're both about thought, about thinking. Right. There's the one, right, that he calls, and this is the one we'll spend a lot of time on, the dogmatic image of thought. And he thinks that most of the history of philosophy has been dominated by the dogmatic image of thought. And it's that image, right, that holds us in its grip. And by holding us in its grip, does not allow us to think otherwise. Right? Now, we've seen examples of it. Right? Aristotle, right? Hegel. But what he wants to do in this chapter is get at the structure of that thought is. How does it work? What are its assumptions? And if he can get at those, then he can ask how we break loose. Right? So near the end of the reading, he talks about how we break loose from this. Right? And we'll talk some about it. And I want to talk about this term. I think we'll have time. That he uses transcendental empiricism. Right? When empiricism goes transcendental, it takes a little working out because I got to contrast that with some other stuff. Right? But that will be for later. Right? The place to start, right, is on the common image of thought. Right? And remember, he says that the common image, the dogmatic image of thought, always starts from what everyone knows. Right? It's always about what everyone knows. Right? And in looking at what everyone knows, he says we keep. Now, I'm going to use the word repetition in the sense he criticizes. We keep saying the same thing over and over again. We're unable to think differently. Right? And what he wants is for us to be able to think differently, to think creatively. Right? And in thinking differently, right, and creatively, we have to be able to open up, right, our thoughts somehow. Right? And we'll get to that. Right? But the way the dogmatic image of thought is, right, is that he says it has three elements, right? Right. One is goodwill, right? The second he calls upright thought, right? And the third is recognition. Right? Goodwill, upright thought, recognition. Goodwill is sincerity. People are thinking sincerely, trying to come up with what is, we could say, the truth. Okay. That's goodwill. He's also going to talk about good sense, which is going to be different from goodwill. Right? He's got good sense and common sense, and I'm going to bring in a passage we haven't read. That, by the way, that will be the most difficult part today. Good sense and common sense, right? Which, because it sounds, oh yeah, good sense, common sense, and right? It's really difficult, right? That's the really rough part. We'll get there, okay? But, right, so goodwill, right, is one thinks sincerely, right? Upright thought. He says this is what the assumption that thought has an affinity for the truth. Thought seeks, finds, mirrors the truth. And how does the truth occur? We recognize it. That's recognition. Deleuze was one of his famous quotes, not from here, but from his book, What is Philosophy? He said, philosophy is not interested in the truth. Right? What it's interested in is the interesting, the remarkable, and the important. Right? Not the truth, the interesting, the remarkable, and the important. But you don't get at the interesting, the remarkable, and the important by following sort of what's right in front of you. We'll see more of that. Right? But I remember I gave a paper on Deleuze one time, and in front of a group of people who were, bless you, who were convinced, right, that philosophy should be just about the truth. And during the question and answer, he said, well, look, there's got to be sort of a truth out there that philosophy is after. He says, after all, you can assume, and there's a wall behind me, right? He says, you can assume, right, all you want that that wall doesn't exist, but if you bang your hand against it, right, you're going to find that there's a truth there. Right? So it's got to be, we have to be after truth. Right? And my response was that, so, you know, I get the idea, okay, if I go like this, right, I'm going to find out there's a truth there. Right? Right? He says, yeah, and that's what you know, isn't that what philosophy is about? I said, well, let me ask you this, right? If I bang my hand against that, well, will anything interesting, remarkable, or important happen? Right? And he said, no. I said, well, then it's not philosophically interesting. Right? There's no point to it. Right? So what he's trying to do is move us away from, right, the concern that philosophy is after the truth, and try to get us somewhere else. But in order to do that, he wants to analyze this way of thinking about philosophy that's dominated philosophy for so long. And he says it has three parts, right? Goodwill, upright thought, recognition. And what we will get from this, right, or what we will be working in, is always within fixed identities. We will never see past what's already given in order to be able to think otherwise, right? Think creatively, open up the possibility of new thought. And to see that, right? Go back to Aristotle. Remember we had Aristotle, let's see. Okay, we had the genera, the species, right, the individuals. And what we were working with whales, and we were working with, what's it? White and black, and whales and horses. Right, so we had, right, okay, the genera was color, animal. Right, now we have, right, white, black, right, whale, horse, right, and it went down from there, okay? Right. But now, in sorting this out, okay, these are your individuals, they fall in these species, they fall in these genera. Where are we starting? Well, we're starting with what everybody knows, all the individual horses in their different colors. So we start with what everybody knows, and we build to the genera, the higher categories, from what people know. We don't disturb this. This is taken for granted, right? This is where we start. Right? And if we start with what everyone knows, we're going to wind up with something perhaps more complicated, but it isn't going to be something nobody knows, right? We'll still wind up with something everybody knows. Right? And this is how he sees philosophy done, right? I'll give you another example, right? This is an example from ethics, right? The philosopher Kant gave a... Actually, we should spend a minute on this, because here I think you can really see it. Kant's ethics, he wanted ethics to come from what he called pure reason, right, or pure practical reason. So he wanted his ethics to be a matter simply of reason. Why? Because Kant thought that what distinguishes us from the animals is we have reason, they don't. And if we're going to act, right, not in an animalistic fashion, we're going to act in accordance with reason. Right? There's some other stuff, but that'll do. All right. It will do, won't it?
It's a little bit more complicated.
It's a little more complicated than that, right? Yes, there is heteronomy and autonomy and all this other stuff, but we're going to pretend, right? Because the interesting stuff for Deleuze is what he arrives at, right? Not where he starts, right? So he thinks, right, that we can reduce morality to a single overarching principle. So you know that? Categorical imperative? Okay. This is for Kant, right? One overarching principle. Which Kant calls the categorical imperative. Okay? Three formulations, actually, well, three or four, right? You know one?
It's something like if you have to do an act for it to be good, you have to do it everybody has to do it. Something like that.
Good. It's a little more complicated.
It's a little bit more complicated. I was hoping so.
Okay. Here's the idea. All right. I asked myself, I'm thinking of doing an act. Right. All right, let's suppose that. Do you know about cars at all?
Well, a little, yes.
Okay, a little. Do you know like how brake systems work in cars?
No.
Okay, perfect. All right. So here's the deal, right? I'm selling a car, right? And the car has worn rotors, right? You know what a rotor is?
Something that turns. But
Yeah, good, but not really, right? You sort of say it is something that turns, right? So here's the deal: in a lot of cars, right? The way the brake works is hydraulic, right? So what happens is you press on the brake, like the liquid stuff goes, and then it goes through to these things called calipers, right? And calipers, they grab the rotor inside the wheel, right? They grab the rotor, and as they grip it, the car slows down. It's the friction that slows down the car. So, and you can look like in your car, you can look through the wheel, right? And you'll see a metal thing, and that's the rotor, right? And the rotors, you have to replace the pads every once in a while, but sooner or later you got to replace the rotors, right? Millie, you'll find all about this when you get your license, right? Sooner or later you get the rotor. You have to replace the rotors, and it's expensive. I'm not killer, but it's expensive, right? And so, all right. So I'm selling a car, right? And I know the car has rotors that need to be replaced, right? So the question that I'm saying, am I obliged morally to tell her about the rotors? Now, Kantian categorical imperative, right? Always act, right? There's like several formulations, but we're going to go for the first classic one, right? Always act in such a way that the principle of your action could be a universal law of nature. Always act so that the principle of your action could be a universal law of nature. Right? So if I'm thinking of doing something, I have to ask myself, can I imagine a world in which everyone did this? Okay? If the answer is yes, I'm supposed to do it. If the answer is no, I'm not supposed to do it. Okay? So what I've got to do is ask myself, right, whether the principle of selling cars with worn rotors without telling people is something I can imagine everybody in the world doing. Can I imagine a world like that? Right? And most people say the answer is no. Right? It can be a little bit more. We can make it a little more general, right? Because if people are deceptive, it's a problem, right? Imagine if everybody were deceptive. Right? What happens in a world where everybody's deceptive?
What means deceptive?
Telling lies, not telling the truth, misleading. What was that?
Then you can't trust it.
Then you can't trust people. And if you can't trust anybody, there's no point in being deceptive. In other words, if you take the idea of being deceptive and you try to make it a universal law, right, you can't do it. Because to be deceptive only works against the background where people are trusting people to tell the truth. So if everybody's deceptive, nobody will trust anybody, and everybody will wind up. Well, and there's been no point to deception. It undercuts itself, right? Now, this is Kant talking, right? So now we see a sort of complicated way of seeing this categorical imperative, right? But the question is this: Kant has all this machinery, right? He's got pure practical reason, thinks in terms of logic, divides people into, he says people are, have these different parts to them. And the question is, what's the morality that comes out of all this, right? I mean, you get all of this machinery is put together, right? What are the principles it generates, right? The 4 principles that he uses as examples: don't lie, right? Don't break your promise, right? Don't give some contributions to the poor, right? And I think the 4th is don't commit suicide, right? So, and you're thinking, that's a lot of machinery for that, right? Right? And plus, by the way, his principles are absolute. Like, don't lie means don't ever lie about anything, right? You can't tell little lies, right? Right. So, for instance, right, when I was starting to go bald, I did once have hair, right? But when I was starting to go bald, right, my wife was very kind about this. She says, "Oh no, you're not losing your hair, right? No. Now look, there are mirrors in my house. I know what was happening, right? But that would have been violating the Kantian categorical imperative, right? Because if everybody lied, nobody would believe anybody, so a lie would never work, right? But all of this machinery, all of this work, and what does he come up with? A bunch of things, right, that most people would say, yeah, pretty much we didn't need all of that machinery to get that, right? That's to say, where does he arrive, right? He arrives at a place where everybody's already occupying anyway. Right? Nothing now interesting, remarkable, or important.
Every
Is that?
schoolboy knows.
Was that?
Yeah,
Every schoolboy knows, right? And so you have, in one way here with Aristotle, in another way with Kant, right? People are thinking in the context of what everyone knows. And he asked the question, and we'll come back to this, right? He asked the question, what would it be like for what we need is someone. He says, if only one who manages not to know what everybody knows, right? And the one who manages not to know what everybody, that's the thinker, okay? Right. But the image of thought that he's working with, he calls it the image. Sometimes he calls it the dogmatic image. Then sometimes he calls it the image. When he says the image of thought, he means the dogmatic image, right? This one, right? And it's called dogmatic. Do you know the term dogmatic? Yeah. Right? Yes? Right? Okay, man?
Domain.
Yeah.
The domain.
Right. The idea is it doesn't question itself, right? It assumes this, right? So you know that I come from South Carolina, so I always my first example is always from the church, right? So the church dogma, the things you believe, right? And then you don't question those things, right? Because when you ask the question, why is that? Well, so why this dogma, right? The answer is always, it's a mystery, right? So those are the things you don't question, right? So the dogmatic image of thought, it takes what everybody knows, right, and doesn't question it, right? And thought proceeds from there, right? And when Deleuze looks out on the history of philosophy, he sees the dominant thought as proceeding from there. So what happens is, okay, step.
I'm just, I'm a little bit curious about, because I understand this idea about dogmatic image of thought, this connection to upright thought, and that thought has the affinity with the truth.
Good.
Is he talking about that this is the nature of thought? Within philosophy, that you're thinking this is the nature of thought, that it's about the truth, and it's being distorted if it's not talking about the truth?
Yes.
In what way?
In the dominant, right? The dominant history of philosophy has been that. What we seek is the truth, and the truth, right, is what we seek is the truth, and the truth is awaiting our recognition. Right? Now he thinks there are philosophers who are not about that, right? He calls it a line of minor philosophers, right? And he talks about Duns Scotus and Hume and Spinoza and Nietzsche.
Chestov.
What?
Chestov.
He doesn't talk about Chestov. Camus talks about Chestov, right? But he doesn't. Does he talk about Chestov? Did you refer? I missed it. Did you refer to Chestov in the reading?
Yeah.
Okay, no. I didn't realize it.
He did so I wondered, he has this phrase where he says, oh, Chestov. And then I thought, well, who's Chestov? So that's why I looked him up.
Right?
What was written about him on Wikipedia, it goes very well along with the Deleuze.
I'm going to go back to this, because I remember you emailed the link, and I haven't had a chance to see that yet. Okay, I'm going to look at this.
We also mentioned something about the idiot, and that made me think about Dostoevsky.
Yeah.
But
Right.
I don't know how these are going.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you wrote back Dostoevsky, so I thought, is he referring to Dostoevsky?
Okay, good.
A very influential thinker, it seems to be.
I think forgotten now, but was very influential.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because, he came from Russia and met with Husserl.
At the risk of
Okay.
playing the idiot, so do so in the Russian manner. That's made me think of that.
Yeah, and Charlotte, I suspect that's the reference, right? Yeah, but then that would be also sort of that line of minor thinkers, right? Not the Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, Locke, right? Kant, Hegel, right? It would be this other line, right? And some people sort of fall in that line. Leibniz was sort of out, and then he was in. But in any case, right? The dominant movement, structure of thought is this dogmatic image stand. Right? I think you had a thought behind that, didn't you?
It was just to understand, because as soon as he says it's a dogmatic image, it's already making a distinction that you could understand thought in another way.
Yes.
It's an image of thought.
Yes.
But I'm not so schooled in classical philosophy.
Okay.
So this is what I mean when he's talking about that thought has an affinity with the truth. How should we understand this? That this is the classical philosopher's way of understanding the function of thought?
That's it.
Or the structure of thought? Or in what
Function.
way? The function of thought.
Yeah.
Pure thought. Or
Yeah, philosophical thought. Thought seeks the truth, right? That's what it seeks, right? And that idea, Stan, is not. I mean, that idea I think is still dominant, right? I mean, if I ask 100 philosophers what is philosophy after, I'm likely to get 90 to say the truth. Right? What it seeks is the truth. Okay. Still okay. It sounds like there's maybe a thought behind that one. Yes? No?
Yeah. No. I was just. I'm just trying to understand what he's criticizing.
Okay.
In
Yes.
more detail.
Yes. Right. And that's what he's criticizing is the idea that what philosophy is after is the truth. Right. But that's part of it. Remember, there's three elements. Right. It's sincere. It's after the truth, and it recognizes the truth when it sees it. Right. There's a recognition there. Right. And to recognize, right, is in his view, right. You recognize it because it's there in front of you. That is to say, it's appeared. That is to say, it's an identity. Right. And there's your affinity. Right.
So it's very close to, I think, also in your book on Deleuze.
Yeah.
You're using the example of the theory of correspondence.
Yes.
So the theory of correspondence is based on the dogmatic image.
I would put it this way. Yeah, it certainly has a deep debt to it, right?
It's not the same.
No, it's not this. Let me put it this way. It's not. It's an example of it.
Yeah.
Okay. In other words, it's not the same because there's more to the dogmatic image than just the correspondence theory of truth, right? But the correspondence theory of truth be one way in which the dogmatic image manifests itself. That would be. You see what I mean? Yeah. Okay. Yes, that would be the case, right? But this idea that philosophers are just after the truth, right? This is not a. It's often not a controversial view within philosophy itself. That's what we seek. We're philosophers. We seek the truth, right? And that's precisely what Deleuze wants to put up for question. Right?
But don't you think all science seeks the truth?
This is interesting on two levels, right? No, this is good. Because on one level, you said something that's very European, right? Which is don't all sciences seek the truth, right? In the U.S., philosophy is not considered a science, right? But it is much more in Europe, right? No, I think that was just interesting on its own. So because it's put into a category, right? In Europe, that's not put. In the States, it's put into humanities, right? It's like English or whatever, right? But hey, come on in. That's good. Okay. I would put it this way, that it's surely the case that all sciences see themselves as seeking the truth, small t. Right?
Small t, what is that?
Right.
Small t.
Truths.
Small t.
Truths of various sorts of another. Right? Much of the history of philosophy is seeking truth, that grounding thing, right? The thing that's going to make sense of all the others, right? So, for instance, right, Descartes, right, the object of reflection, of philosophical reflection, was to ground all of our knowledge. And if we couldn't ground all of our knowledge in something certain, then all of it could be false. It could all be illusion. So what did Descartes do, right? He doubted everything he could possibly figure out how to doubt, right? And then got back to this doubting being, the one who, I can't doubt that there's somebody doing the doubting. Right? And then he builds back up, right? He says, okay, there's somebody, there's got to be somebody doing the doubting, and then he basically works God into it, right? God's got to be there for reasons we don't need to worry about, right? But it grounds all of knowledge, right? And as late as 20th century, right? The German philosopher Husserl said this. It was a very similar project, grounding our knowledge. So, while science might give us particular truths, they assume things about the structure of truth. They assume what knowledge is. So we need philosophy to give us, right, what knowledge is, right. Otherwise, the sciences are just kind of floating, right. So, right, it's I think true, Gilles, that the sciences give us truths, right, but philosophy, on the traditional dogmatic image, right, often seeks to give us, right, something grander, right, truth itself, right, which will reveal itself to us, right. When we are, when we're faced with it. Right. So now, Stan, I'll come back. So you see this, right? You see the image he's got here. Deleuze has got here, right? I mean, it raises. Oh, Alan.
No, I just want to say that this was actually the discussion, as far as I understood, between Einstein and Bohr. Einstein thought that we could get truth with a big T and Bohr and the quantum physics.
Mm-hmm.
He said, no, we can only show what our apparatus can show us, so that's truth with a little t. So I think that Niels Bohr's philosophy goes very well along with some of the ideas that you're presenting. And so it's not about the fundamental truth with capital letter, but as far as we know so far.
Good. Charlotte, jump in.
I think that is also his point about the doxa and the paradoxa and whatever it comes to. But isn't that also a point that this presupposes that there is a truth, that truth exists?
Yes, it does.
And then truth must have some kind of fixed identity. Or
Yes, it does.
faculties.
That's the second assumption. Thought has an affinity with the truth, right? That's exactly right, right? Now, but I want to come back, Alan, to Gilles, jump in. Okay. I want to come back to something you said a moment ago. That Deleuze would side with Niels Bohr in as much as he's criticizing Einstein, right? And part of the issue is the issue of quantum mechanics versus Einsteinian, right? Einsteinian physics, right? There is a truth of things, right? Quantum mechanics is you can only have probabilities. That's the best you get, right? It's probabilities, right? And Einstein's famous response to this was God doesn't play dice with the universe. It's not about probabilities. It's about the way things are, right? But here's...
And this boy answered, you know what he answered?
No.
He said, I don't think we should decide what God does.
Good. But here's where he's going to get off the train with Niels Bohr. Because for Deleuze, truth isn't even the issue. Okay? Now, we might put it this way. That some people say, well, is he after falsity then? Right? And the answer is no, right? Is he after falsity? Is he in favor of falsity? And the answer is no, right? Right? He's not concerned about truth, and if he's not concerned about truth, why would he be concerned about falsity, right? He's not. Those aren't things that interest him. What interests him is what's interesting, remarkable, and important. Right? That's what interests him. Might it be true? Sure, right? Might it be false and yet yield something interesting, remarkable, or important? Yes, right? And that's where thought ought to go, right? But where thought usually goes, right, in the dogmatic image, right, is always toward the truth. Interesting or not, right? It goes toward the truth. And in doing so, I want to see if this is the moment where we really got to hit the hard one stuff. Yeah, okay. In doing so, right, it is often structured by what he calls good sense and common sense, right? But before we hit those two, because that's the really rough stuff today, right? Before we hit those two, let me ask, okay so far, right? Right? We see this, the image that he's criticizing, what it involves, the idea has that it's about goodwill, upright thought, and recognition, that it stays with identities, it's always within the realm of what everybody knows. Right? Which, I mean, it's not to say philosophy doesn't tell us anything we don't know, but it's grounded in what everybody knows. It will never raise deep questions about what everyone knows. Right? And in order for thinking, in Deleuze's sense, to take place, somehow we have to get cut loose in ways that we'll talk about later. Right? We have to get cut loose from what everyone knows. Right? Now, is that okay so far? Yeah? Okay. Anything we want to follow with that? Good? Okay. He says that a lot of the dogmatic image of thought is founded in common sense and good sense, right? So we're going to get the passage, right, and we're going to sort of slowly unpack the passage, take a deep breath, we will get through this, right? And then when we come out the other side, right, then we're going to make our transition into what he thinks thinking is, okay? But now, on our page, I know we have several different texts running here. We are 226, right? And now the trick is, this made a piece of it's the beginning of chapter 5, right? For those who have another text, beginning of chapter 5. You go, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, about 5, 6 pages in, right? And it begins. We are at least in a position. I want to make sure. Just shout out another page number. We're 226. There's another page number comes up.
298.
298? You did. Matthias, do you have the same as Alan? 298?
298.
Right? Chapter 5? Charlotte, you're working with one. Are you working with ours?
I'm 222.
222?
Yes, it must be another edition.
Oh my God, it's got the same cover on it.
Well, chapter 5 exactly starts at 2.
Wait, 220. What? Your paragraph? The paragraph begins what?
No, the paragraph. Okay.
Try 226.
Yes.
See if that, because I think we have the same edition. 226, left hand, right?
At least. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Same edition, right? Okay, good. Is everybody right? So okay, right. So and this is going to be a long quote, right? All right. We are at least in a position to clarify the relationship between good sense and common sense, okay? And in thinking about these words, use them as placeholder words, like difference and things like that. Don't try to say, okay, I have this image of what good sense is or common sense. Don't worry about that, right? Okay. All right. Common sense was defined subjectively by the supposed identity of a self, which provided the unity and ground of all the faculties, right, parts of your mind, and objectively by the identity of whatever object served as the focus for all the faculties. Okay. This double identity, however, remains static. Right? So say it again, then we're going to linger over it. Right? Common sense was defined subjectively by the supposed identity of a self, which provided the unity and ground of all the faculties, and objectively by the identity of whatever object served as a focus for all the faculties. So the picture is you have a self and the object. Right? And remember what it's thinking, what is the self doing? It's thinking about the object. It's the dogmatic image of thought. Thought's relation to the world. Okay? So, right, the self, right, is composed of a set of faculties that work together. Right? Those faculties train themselves on the object in a unified way so that the object can give itself to the self or the subject. Right? What's sometimes called the subject-object distinction. Right? So you have a unified self confronting a unified object. Nothing gets lost. Right? Everything's there. Okay? But he says this is static. Right? It's a static picture. Right? This is common sense. The reason I think, by the way, he calls it common sense is that this idea is common to all cells, right? And this is common to all objects, I suspect, right? But then when we hit good sense, I got nothing for you, right? I don't know why he calls it good sense. Right? Okay, this double identity, however, remains static, right? So we no more find ourselves before a universal indeterminate object, right? Than we are a universal self. So the idea is that there are selves and there are objects, but if we just stay here, the selves don't have any particular identity, and the objects don't have any particular identity. Right? So there has to be more to the story. Right? And the more to the story, right, is the good sense. Okay? Right, so now, objects are divided up in and by fields of individuation as ourselves. Right? There's different kinds of objects. Right. We can think here of Aristotle, right? There's various kinds of individuals. And there's different kinds of cells. He said common sense must therefore point beyond itself toward another dynamic instance, right? Common sense was too static, right? To a dynamic instance capable of determining the indeterminate object as this or that, giving it a particular identity. This or that, right? And of individualizing the self situated in this ensemble, this group of objects, right? So, this isn't simply an object, right? It's this white horse, right? This black elephant, right? And this isn't simply a self, it's Todd, right? Or Gilles, right? Or Matthias, right? So now we have individualized selves. Not just this static, abstract self, but something individualized, right? Right. This other instance, the individualized one, is good sense, which takes its point of departure from a difference at the origin of individuation, at the level of the individuals. Right? However, precisely because it ensures the distribution of that difference in such a manner that it tends to be cancelled in the object, I'll explain that part. That's the key move, right? That it's cancelled in the object, and because it provides a rule according to which the different objects tend to equalize themselves and the different cells become uniform, good sense in turn points toward the instance of common sense, which provides it both with the form of a universal self and indeterminate object. Right? So now, it's that phrase that the distribution of difference tends to be cancelled in the object. Okay. Right. A little bit too much, right? Yeah. Think of it this way, right? Come back to Aristotle. Okay, and let's see. Okay. Right. Remember Aristotle? Get the general. And let's suppose we have this black whale. Now we've individuated, right? Right. We have good sense. We see each thing for what it is. Right. But what is this thing? Right. Well, this thing is this black whale. Right. Well, what is this thing that is the? Well, what characterizes is that it is black, and it's a whale. Right? So now what we've done is we pop back up to the general categories. Right? So we start with an abstract self and an abstract object. Right? That's too static and too abstract. Right? So we move down into particulars. Right? Right? And here are our particulars. Right? This black whale, that white horse. Those particulars, though, are referenced through categories. Right? That's to say, now, Anna, the individual differences tend to cancel themselves out in the object because the object is referred to in terms of general categories, which pops us back up to, right, common sense. Right? So common sense and good sense, right, are in a play together with each other. Right? Right? We move from the abstract, right, down to concrete identities, but instead of moving from those concrete identities into something deeper, we pop back up, right, to the general and the abstract. So we are always within what everybody knows. Right? And when Aristotle, all of Aristotle's writings, right? Actually, let me say this, right? Aristotle didn't have writings. Aristotle had lectures, right? And the thought was that the writings that came down to us, that much of them were not his, right? But were notes, right? He had like grad students or something. I don't know, but he had. They took these notes, and those were the lectures, right? And one of the speculations around this is that Aristotle's contemporaries praise him for his writing. They talk about how beautiful and and melodic his voice was. And you read Aristotle, and it couldn't be drier, right? And so a lot of people have thought this can't be him, right? Because this can't be the person they're referring to. But it's his ideas, right? But his method was always to start with common opinion. Has to stop. Well, what do people think about this, right? What is the common opinion of this? So he starts from the category of common opinions and works trying to build from there his philosophical views. Now, he's not going to just repeat common opinion, but that's where he starts. That's to say, where does he start? He starts with what everybody knows, right? And never loses touch with that. And that's his difference from a key difference from Plato, right? Plato rejected what everybody knew. We're going to come back to that in a minute, right? He called that opinion, right? The Greek is doxa, D-O-X-A, right? That's opinion. We have to move away from opinion in order to get to real knowledge. Right? So, Deleuze, he's got this funny relationship. We saw it last week. This funny relationship with Plato, right? So, he is with Plato on the idea that you reject doxa and opinion, what everybody knows, right? But not in favor of the higher truth, right? Charlotte, the forms, the ideas you were asking about, right? That's not where he goes, okay? All right, so the good sense and common sense refer back to each other, right? All rooted in the idea, right, that we are capable in confronting identities of recognizing the truth. Perhaps this, but hopefully this. Now, the transition that he makes in the text, right, to the next step, right, the transition is the transition that he says, Plato rejects this, he sees it all as doxa. Right? But what Plato is going to do is go for a higher form of truth. Right? Question is, how does this rejection, right, occur? How do we move from what everybody knows to what he would call thought, right, real thinking. Right? So I was going to suggest, because then now we're sort of in part two, right? You want to take 5 minutes, went to the bathroom, right, and then come back? Yes? Alan says no, keep going. I don't know, what do you want to do?
Anyone who needs a break?
Anybody need a break? We're good? Are we good? Okay, let's keep going. Right. God, I love you guys. Right? I mean, you just can keep doing philosophy, right?
We don't use break.
Okay. Now,
It's about the rulers that doesn't function.
but the what?
I just went back to the ruler that doesn't function.
The-
Try to
When
make
you were selling the car,
Yeah.
you do not break.
Oh, the rotor, right?
Okay, ruler.
Yeah.
Potato.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. It all. You know, the thing is, let me tell you. The thing is that, like, you teach the stuff, and I put my soul out here in front of you, right? I have no idea what you guys are going to remember, right? Like, I'm going to meet Charlotte like 5 years from now, right? And I'm going to say, you remember that Deleuze course? She says, I remember the rotor, right? The rotor, I remember. But I assume you're Charlotte, not the one that I saw there earlier, right? Well, you've denied it. But I have to say this, I said hello to somebody who looked like Charlotta, and it turns out, and I did remember this because I thought I want to check to be sure, because she was wearing this sort of white and black flowery pants thing, right? And I thought to myself, I'm going to make sure when you walk in that there's the flowery pants thing, right? And that was my first. I saw you walk in, and my first thought was, damn. Okay.
Hvad hedder de nu? Småkagen.
Cookies.
The cookies has to.
Okay, right. We don't need a break, but we do need sugar.
No, we do.
Okay, so here's the question. Right. What forces us to think? And Deleuze gives an answer. This is the only other quote I'll use, but I think this is really key. For us, it's 139. Right? Charlotta, that would be 139.
Thank you.
And, okay, now I got...
This is chapter.
This is good. Now, this is in the image of thought. And what it is, Alan, I'm hoping you guys have a thing where you have a... It's halfway through the reading for today, almost. And there's a break, and there is this little break, and then there's a quote, like some reports of our perceptions.
182.
Okay, now keep going, right? There's that full paragraph, and then the next paragraph is something in the world forces us to think.
183.
183? Good. Matthias, good? Well, we are 139. We're 139. Okay? Does that make sure we're all good? Matthias, good?
Yeah.
Okay, we're all good? Okay. Something in the world forces us to think. This something is an object not of recognition. Remember, recognition. Dogmatic image of thought. Right? This something is not of recognition, but of a fundamental encounter. Right? What is encountered may be Socrates, a temple, or a demon. It may be grasped in a range of affective tones, right? Emotional tones. Wonder, love, hatred, suffering. In whichever tone, its primary characteristic is that it can only be sensed. I'm going to come back to that, right? In this sense, it is opposed to recognition. Right? Now, I want to come back to those last two sentences in a bit, but I want to start with the first one. Right? Thought occurs not through the affinity of our thinking with what we can recognize. Right? Thought occurs, right, when there's an encounter. Something forces us to think. Right? And he said, it may be Socrates, maybe a temple or a demon. Right? Let's start with, why might it be Socrates that forces us to think? Well, in this... Here, we're going to say something?
What does that mean?
Socrates.
Socrates.
Right.
Sorry.
That's all right, right? So why might it be Socrates? Here's what happened is his dialogues, right? People come along, right? They have views of what things are, right? And he forces an encounter, right? He makes them uncomfortable. All of a sudden, they have a sense there's something more than what I thought. Put it another way, he challenges doxa, right? Put it another way, he challenges what everybody knows, right? Right? And this is the part, again, Deleuze has a very complicated relationship with Plato. Right? This is the part that he's keen on. Right? That you meet Socrates, and all of a sudden you no longer know what everybody knows. Right? That's the encounter. It forces you. There's a discomfort. Right? Something happens. And he sometimes describes it in negative tones. Right? But if we go to the affective, we'll see it's not always negative. Right? He says, right, it could be Socrates, it could be a temple, it could be a demon. Right? He says, it may be grasped in a range of affective tones. Wonder, love, hatred, suffering. Right? Wonder, love, hatred, suffering. Right? Right? What happens when you meet Socrates? Right? Generally, it's going to be more on the suffering side. Right? Because there's something you were comfortable with, something you were confident about, something that was important, and you knew it. And you were comfortable with it. Right? And now you're not. Right? Now you experience discomfort. But it doesn't have to be that. Right? He says it can be wonder, right? He talks about wonder and love. Right? And a number of philosophers, right? Including philosophers you wouldn't think, like I mentioned this Husserl before, a very analytic, he's a continental tradition, but sort of an analytic thinker, tends to write as precise as he can, often comes off very dry, right? He said philosophy begins in wonder. It begins when all of a sudden, right, we begin to ask about the world. We don't take it as given, right? And in not taking it as given, it could be because we get disturbed by something, but it doesn't have to be that we're disturbed by something. It could be, for instance, right, we find it remarkable that it exists, right? Right? Leibniz had the question, why is there something rather than nothing? We find this wondrous, right? That there's something rather than nothing. And as we find this wondrous, what happens, right? Right? Well, then we're no longer taking everything for granted. Right? So it can happen that way. Right? Right? So, but what all of these have in space is the different affective tones, right? What all these different affective tones have in common is the idea that we're no longer taking what there is for granted. We're no longer comfortable with recognition. Right? Something has happened such that we no longer know what everybody knows. Right? That's the move. Right? And he says, we don't do it. We don't choose it. Right? It happens to us. And you're thinking about something right here, right?
Thank you. I'm doing it. I'm thinking.
Okay, right.
So this is
right, but it looks like you have something in mind right here.
Yeah, we don't choose it. It happens to us.
It happens to us.
Yeah.
Right. Think of it this way, right? I'm going to give you sort of a couple everyday instances, and then we'll move into the philosophy stuff. Okay. Okay, yeah, I start with the really everyday, then a little bit more, and then so I'm going to do 3 different examples. Each one moving us a little closer to philosophy. Okay, right. First one, right? Cars, right? You're never far from cars. When you drive your car, right? Your car is not an object. Merely for you, the car is the object because you're learning, right? But when you've learned the car is not an object, it's not in your consciousness, right? You're in the car, and there's a way in which the car itself is just sort of not there for you, right? You just, you drive. The road is there for you. The people around are there for you. But the car is not there for you. Right? Until what? Until you hear that grinding noise in the engine, right? And then all of a sudden the car is very much there for you, right? You hear that grinding noise, and then you realize, I'm in a car, right? And this thing is now taking my attention, okay? So what happened, right? You were just going along, right? And it happens to you, right?
Yes.
Right? You're forced,
Yes.
right, out of taking the car for granted into like looking at the car. Now the car is no longer taken for granted. Okay? First thing.
Yes.
Okay? All right. Next example. Move a little bit. So again, we'll move a little bit closer.
And then you have an encounter with the car.
Exactly. You have an encounter, right? You have an encounter, or we could put it this way, right? The car forces an encounter upon you, right? Something along that line, right? All right, next example, right? You're doing counseling, right? Conversational practice, right? Right. You know what you're doing, right? You know how it goes. You've been doing it for years, right? And somebody comes in, they're discussing something, you relate to their experience, right? And they say, no, that's not it, right? It's this thing here. Okay, and you step back and say, okay, it wasn't what I thought it was, right? Is it this? No, right? And you keep going, and you keep not getting it, right? And you walk out of the session, right? And all of a sudden, your own practice and history, right, is now thematic for you. It's there for you in a way it wasn't before, right? So, and so that happens. That it can happen in therapy. It can happen in philosophy too, by the way, right? So, I've developed over the years sort of certain views of certain things, and I see how they fit together, right? And then periodically I read something, and I'm thinking, if this is right, and it may be, I've got a problem, right? Because what I've been thinking, I've got to rearrange, right? So it can happen like that, right? But then what happens is, I no longer am in the flow of the thing itself. I've had an encounter. I'm thrown back on myself, right? And being thrown back on myself, right? I now have to ask. I now ask a series of questions which I took for granted earlier, right? Right. There was no reason to question it. It was just there. It unfolded the way it unfolds, right? Right. And so in philosophy, it could be somebody asks you a question, right? And yeah, I know the answer. Right? And there's this, and then they ask a question, and there's this, and then they sort of move that question, and then there's a point of reckoning. You think, okay, this is threatening, right? Right. And that's where you're no longer taking for granted. Jump in.
And this is often what happens in the witnessing processes. You did not know what would come up from the story that the client told you, and then you are immediately thrown back on yourself.
Yes. And it seems to me now, I'm going to suggest something, and then you guys tell me if I was wrong. That I think there may be at least two ways in which that unexpected can happen. Right? There can be. Should I put it this way? Yeah, I'll try this. Right. It could be the expected unexpected, and the unexpected unexpected. Right. So there can be the things you don't expect, but in these areas here, right? I know I don't know what's going to happen, right? It's when you know what's going to happen, right? And it doesn't, right? That's when you get thrown back on yourself, right? That's the encounter, right? Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Right. So what happens then? He says it's a fundamental encounter. Something throws you back on yourself. Now, and a third example, right? And this is going to be the philosophy example, right? Right. Something happens that's going to be we could say, something unexpected that throws you back on yourself, but in a larger way. It isn't just about your practice. It certainly isn't just about your car, right? Right. But it's about the way things are. And that throwing back on yourself, right, can be something that can be disturbing, or he said it's something that can be wondrous, right? That all of a sudden, what the going along with things doesn't make it seems to get thrown off somehow, maybe even willingly, right?
Maybe what?
Even willingly, maybe you're comfortable with it. That's the wonder, right?
Yes.
But it happens to you, right? So, just as you don't choose your car, right, to break down, just as you don't choose the moments in which the client says the unexpected, right? You don't choose the moments when this encounter. You don't think to yourself, "I'm going to have a fundamental encounter with the nature of being today," right? That's not how it goes, right? Right? You go along, you do your bit, right? Right? And then something happens and throws you, right? Yeah, that's it. Right?
Is that
That was, by the way, a great sound effect.
Is it what? Oh.
Did you hear what she
You
did?
got the sound thing going on.
Yeah. No, I said something. You're going along, and then. Can you read it?
Yes.
Yeah. That's it. Right. You're thrown back on yourself. Alan, jump in.
Is that what Deleuze means when he speaks about becoming worthy of the event?
That would be the next stage. In other words, right, the thing happens to you, right? And then the question is, am I worthy of it, right? Am I going to try to ignore it and go back to the everyday, pretend that thing didn't happen? Or am I going to rise to it, right? So being worthy of it is not when the encounter happens. It's rising to the level of what the encounter is asking of you. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's in that neighborhood, but it's the next thing. Right? To be worthy of the event is to be worthy of that thing that's out of place that is happening to you. Right? Yes. Okay? Good so far? Good? Okay. But now, right? Now I want to go to the next two sentences, because the next two sentences are going to connect us back to what we talked about before. Okay. He says, in whichever tone, remember the effective tones, wonder, love, hatred, suffering, in whichever tone, its primary characteristic is that it can only be sensed. He says, in this sense as opposed to recognition. In this sense, it is. And by the way, there may be sort of a translation issue there. When he says in this sense, he doesn't mean sensed in this same as the previous sentence. Okay? Sorry. Right. I mean, well, the guy who translated Paul Patton, right? I know him. He's really good. I mean, when he translates Deleuze, you can trust him, right? I think this was just a sort of a point in which it was hard to say. You make choices, right? And he probably made a choice and may not have thought, okay, there could be a little bit of confusion here, right? He might. I suppose you could read this second sentence in this way, right? It's opposed to recognition. Okay. But it's something that can only be sensed. Right? So why is this something that can only be sensed? Right? Think of it this way, right? That something has happened to you. You've had an encounter. If you could recognize what happened in that encounter, if you could account for it, then it's not an encounter, right? It's back in recognition. Oh yeah, it was that, right? Right. So, go ahead, Sam.
But it might be still an encounter, but it just doesn't force to think. Doesn't force you to think.
Yeah, I think it's just a semantic issue, right? I think when he's using the word encounter, he means you're forced to think, right? You're right, and says something could throw you off.
No, it's just because in the reading of Spinoza,
right?
He's talking about you can have an encounter with Paul, or you can have an encounter with another guy in his lectures. He says one gives you a good feeling, another gives you a bad feeling.
Yes.
But it doesn't. It's not like he doesn't recognize Paul or the other guy. It's because I think he's taking the term encounter from Spinoza.
Good question. I don't know, Stan. I don't know if they're taking it. It could be, right? And you know what I'm saying? You can have a good or a bad encounter, right?
Yeah, that's Spinoza.
Yeah. I'm tempted to say here, Stan, and this is just my interpretation, right? I'm tempted to say, when he's using the encounter in this context, he means you're forced to think.
Yeah,
okay. That's just how I'm reading it. That if you're not forced to think, it's not an encounter, right? That's just my read on that, right? But if we went with your read, it would be that we're forced we have an encounter, and sometimes that encounter forces us to think, right? So I think we're on the same page. Yes. Yeah. Okay. But now, right? In thinking about this, right? Then he says, if it is an encounter, if it forces you to think, it can't be brought back into recognition. And if it can't be brought back into recognition, then it can't be, right? We can say, I want to use another. I'm going to have to use this. It can't be recognized. it can only be sensed. Which is to say, there's something there that lies beyond my recognition, something I cannot bring into my recognition. But I'm sensing it there. Right? I'm going to say the same thing, but I'm going to say it slightly different. Right?
But you are sensing the effect, or?
I don't even know. You know, am I sensing it? Am I sensing the effect? I don't know. Right? There's just this moreness there. Right?
It's not in some known category.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, I'm sensing something beyond, right, what presents itself to me. And in presenting something beyond what presents itself to me, right, I'm not in the position to say, what is it, a cause, is it an effect, what is it, right? We could say it's just that there is more than what is presented to me. Right? There is more than what the identities that everybody knows are all about. Right? And that's all I have at this point. Right? At the beginning, right? What forces me to think is that there's whatever identities are in front of me, all I can be sure of, all I sense is there's more. Right? Whatever there is, it isn't reducible to what the identities are that I'm presented with. Right? That's the encounter. And the encounter, then, he says, forces, I mean, if you're going to take it up, right? If you're going to be worthy of it, right? It forces you to think. But if you're going to think now, in this sense, you're not engaged in what he called, you're no longer engaged in the dogmatic image of thought. Because you're beyond the identities. Right? The identities don't have the grip on you. Right? What has a grip on you is the thing that can't fit the identities. Right? The thing you can't bring into presence. Right? That's what's got the grip.
You're in the midst of difference.
Yeah. And that's the sense that he has is going to be, and that's what I want to move, take a couple steps to get there, but that's it, right? That what the name he gives for that thing which you sense is difference. Now, I want to say something about this, then I'm going to swing back to Kant, and then the last thing we'll do is transcendental empiricism. Okay. On what Deleuze is presenting, right, on this picture that he's presenting, we are no longer doing philosophy, as coming back to then that we do it, in the way it traditionally was done. We're seeking beyond philosophy, beyond the dogmatic image of thought, for another way to think what's happening. And however we approach it, what we know is that our consideration of it, our reflection on it, is not going to be able to put it back in the kind of categories we're used to. Which, by the way, is why Deleuze is so hard. No, well, that and the fact that he's French and he feels compelled to write obscurely. But I mean, that issue aside, right? It's a shame, right? Because actually, a lot of the stuff he could have said in ways that people would understand, right? But he's not allowed to, right? That's the problem, right? It's the law of the French intellectual, right? You've got to write obscurely. Okay. All right. So this point here, and again, here's where I think there's no easy way to think what he's asking us to think, because all of the usual ways of thinking it put it back into an identity.
Because it's beyond categories still.
Yes. And in the book that I wrote about, I said we don't categorize difference. I use the word, there's English to palpate, right? Palpate, right? You feel its effects, or you sense, right? that you palpate difference, right? You don't think it directly. And interestingly, right, one of the thinkers that he takes, and he's got a reference in here quickly, that precedes him, that's got an idea similar to this, or at least an illustration of it, is, of all people, Kant. Kant has three main critiques, right? Critique of pure reason, a critique of practical reason, and the last one's the critique of judgment. Right? And in the critique of judgment, he talks about beauty. And he says that beauty, the experience of beauty happens, he says, when the faculties, right, our mental powers are all aligned. Right? Right. But there's another experience that Kant talks about, which is the experience of the sublime. Right? And the experience of the sublime is not the experience of the beautiful. A lot of French thinkers, by the way, have found this particular aspect of Kant particularly fascinating, because it's the one moment in Kant where he moves beyond everything fitting together, right, into something that throws it all into question. Right? So what's the sublime? Right? The sublime, the experience of the sublime, right? We say the experience of the beautiful is sort of, in a way, can be calming, right? Everything fits, right? You feel, right? Let's say you see a beautiful picture, right? And everything fits, right? And you can feel a sense of peace, right? The sublime goes in the other direction. It's an experience of discordance, right? An experience where things don't fit. An experience of the faculties being overwhelmed. And Kant gives a couple of examples of this, right? One of the examples he gives, I think he gives the example of like a mountain. I'm trying to remember, but I think there's a mountain. Do you know this? There's like a mountain, it's like an overwhelming mountain range, right? Let's say, right, you stand at the base of the Himalayas, right? Those are the big ones, right? Yeah. Right. You stand at the base of the Himalayas, right? And you're overwhelmed by it, right? Or it can be, right? You. One place I thought of it, because sublime, don't think it's necessarily a good thing, right? So in the tsunami, yeah. right? It was the overwhelmingness of nature, right? And what made it so overwhelming is it's like you can't wrap your mind around it. You're faced with it, and there's no way to get it. And what happens is, right, rather in the face of the sublime, rather than your faculties coming together in some kind of harmony, right? It's as though it's overwhelmed. It goes in the other direction. So there's beauty, but then there can be sublime beauty, which now undercuts, right, the concordance, the harmony of the faculties and beauty. So the experience of the sublime is the experience of the thing you can't process. Right? The thing that's beyond your ability to process. That there's something about it, right, that defies you to categorize it, to come to terms with it. And what it gives you the experience of is that there's more, right? There's more than you can account for. And in the sublime, you're faced with it. Right? So the sublime, interestingly enough, here's Kant, right? The critique of pure reason. Here's how the faculties work. Here's how they fit together. Here's when the reason is going beyond what it can know. Right? Then there's the critique of practical reason. Here's your morality. Here's your principle. Here's how how freedom fits with morality. Here's the presuppositions we have to have. Here's where God fits into this. Then the first part of the critique of judgment. Here's beauty. Here's how all the faculties come together. And then you have the sublime. Right? Oh, by the way, right? This doesn't always work. Right? Right? Something can happen that overwhelms. And this is, and Deleuze, now you can see why Deleuze is going to pick this up, right? Right? The sublime is the encounter that's beyond your ability to process, right? And instead, that reference to sublime is that's how I'm sort of thinking about the encounter, right? The thing, like when you hit it, you can't go back, right? It's an experience that forces you to try to come to terms, right? But with the sublime in Kant, you will always fail. But then the question Deleuze wants to say is, well, how might we think things such that our categories can fail? How do we go on, right, when our categories may fail? How do we do thought? Right? How do we do philosophy in the wake of the failure of our categories? And at that moment, right, what appears is the person who no longer knows what everyone knows. Now, I say I've got one more step. It will take a little while. This is the transcendental empiricism, right? But before I do, I want to stop and see if we have questions or thoughts, right? Do you see how what he thinks thought is connects to this idea of difference that he was talking about before, right? Right? Basically, what he's done in the first part of the chapter is he's said, here's how we usually go about thinking about this stuff. Here's how philosophy usually works, right? And what it gives us is nothing creative, right? There's nothing new that goes on, right? There's nothing novel that's happening, right? Right? We keep winding back up in the same place. It may have more. If in English, so something has bells and whistles, right? Yeah. Is there similar in Danish?
Yeah, I think
Okay. The idea is when something has more bells and whistles, it's like got a little fancier design on it, but still the same thing, right? So the idea is you have something and you put on little bells so it rings, and you put on little whistles, but you still got the same thing, right? Anyway, in the end, that's the idea, right, of bells and whistles, right? So he says most of the history of philosophy is a history of bells and whistles, right? Right. Puts but never moves us from the same place. Right? And what he wants thought to do is move us from the same place. I think there's one quote, and I should have noted this, right? But he says, right, what is a thought that has never harmed anyone? Right? Right. He wants us to move and get free of ourselves. Guess it.
But after the encounter, at some point, what happens? Because you encounter something,
right,
that you don't know what it is.
Good.
And you think, wow.
Yeah.
What's this?
Okay, good.
But at one point, usually we form an idea. It might be something completely new.
Right.
But then what does Deleuze say? We make a representation of it at one point, or because
Well, what he's on about here, right, is the next step is how to think this, right? How to think the beyondness, since we can no longer think it in the ways in which we're used to thinking. That's the task in difference and repetition. How does thought move once it's had the encounter? Does that make sense? Yeah. Which, Alan, come back one more time. How does thought become worthy of the event? Right. In this particular. So in this case, the issue is how does thought proceed? Right. How does thought proceed? Right. How does it move? Right. In order to be able to stay with this thing, right, that it is sensed, right? And we know how it can't move, right? Right? The way it can't move is by putting it back in identities and categories. So how can it move, right? And again, I'm going to start talking about transcendental empiricism in a bit, right? But again, questions, thoughts. I want to make sure this feels comfortable. Transcendental empiricism is a bit starting toward the answer, right? And don't worry, right? It's one of those terms, right, that you'll be able to kind of kick around, right? And then people will think, right, you're either that cool, right, or that dorky, right? And I'll leave it to you which way that's going to go, right? But before we go there, questions, thoughts, Does this? Let me ask this: does this feel continuous with what we've been discussing? You see why he's making the moves he's making here, given the other stuff that we've talked about with him. Yeah? Okay? Okay. All right. So, let's talk a little bit.
Todd, if you take the other pen, it's easier to see because that's what you're
What's that?
writing. You're writing one to the whiteboard. If you take the ones down there.
Those?
Yeah.
Okay, I got it. So this is going to be different?
Yeah.
Ooh. Did I spell that right? I hope I spelled that right. Okay. Okay. In contrast to, this is Kant. Transcendental idealism. Okay. All right. First, the word transcendental is one that's often mistaken, and I always remember what it really means and what the mistake is, because I made that mistake in a public paper I gave, and it was a very embarrassing correction for me. Right. Right. Transcendental does not mean transcendent. Right? Transcendence is to go beyond something when you transcend, right? Actually, I should probably write. Okay. I believe these words are close in Danish to the English. Right. Transcendence is to go beyond something. Yeah. Right. Immanence is to remain within something. So, and the word transcendental does not refer to transcendence. Kant uses the word. Now we'll start with Kant, and Kant will be the transcendental idealist. Then we will move to Deleuze, who's the transcendental empiricist. Right? Kant uses the term transcendental idealism. The word transcendental, and I'll give you the definition, and it will take a little while just to sort this out of it. Right? When Kant uses the word transcendental, he's talking about the conditions of possibility of experience. The conditions of possibility of experience. Don't worry, trust me on this. It's going to work out. The conditions of possibility of experience. For Kant, the question is, for us to have the experiences that we have, what must be in place? What must be there for it to be possible for us to have these experiences? And for Kant, right, the idea was that what we must have to have these experiences is a certain structure of the human mind. To experience the world in the way we do, we must have an experience of space. I'm going to make this a little simple, right? An experience of space, an experience of time. We must have the category of causality. Because if you try to imagine that the events that nothing causes anything else, right? The world it's going to fall apart, right? So there are categories we must have. There are experiences we must have, right? There's ways things must appear. No. There are things that must be in place in the human mind in order for us to have the experience that we do, right? Put this another way, right? Those are the transcendental conditions of experience. of possible experience. For us to have any possible experience, those are the transcendental conditions. So, now, we've got the transcendental part, right? Now we're going to go to the idealism part. For Kant, those transcendental conditions, the conditions of the possibility of having experience, are in us. Right? Right. We bring them to and impose them on experience. So they're in our minds. And idealism often refers to the idea of something being in your mind, right, as opposed to out there. So transcendental idealism is the position that the conditions of possibility, of experience, are within us. We carry to our experience spatiality, right? We experience things spatially. We carry temporality. We carry causality. These are things we carry with us. And for something to be an experience, it has to conform to these things. Any possible experience has to conform to these things. So the conditions of possible experience are in our minds. Is the thing we're experiencing, so if I'm looking at the table, is that experience that I'm having an experience of the table as it is in itself? Well, Kant would say, I can only experience it as I experience it. I can't even ask that question, right? He says, there's the phenomena, what appears to me, and there's the pneuma, the thing in itself, as it is in itself outside my experience. Right? And Kant's view is, I can't say anything about a thing in itself. I can only say a thing about how it appears to me. But how it appears to me has to be in space and time, right? In categories of causality and other things like that. Any possible experience has to conform to those. Right. Now we'll stop. Here, I'm going to check it with you. Right? Is this okay? Something's still not so quite so okay. Can you tell me where you're feeling uncomfortable?
No, not really.
Okay.
Go on.
I don't know. Should we go on?
So you meet your new experience with all the experience you have already been through, and you have collected in you.
It's not when you've collected in you. It's your structure of your mind has to be certain ways in order for you to have any experience at all.
Okay. The other way around.
That's it. I feel like you just got comfortable with it. Right. It's funny how that works. When you make
me.
Was that?
I thought you encountered me.
Okay. No, it's funny how you speak as a switch, right? By the way, when I was doing transcendence, confusing transcendence and transcendental, right, and I was corrected on it, I had them. Oh, that's it, right? And then large parts of Deleuze began to make sense to me, right? That I hadn't before. Fortunately for me, there weren't that many people studying Deleuze at that point, so I was embarrassed in front of a small crowd rather than a larger one, right? But, all right, okay, transcendental idealism, right? Now, transcendental empiricism. Right? This is Deleuze, okay? He asks, not what are the conditions of all possible experience, he asks, what are the conditions of real experience? That's to say, not what must be there in order for us to have an experience at all. That's the Kantian question. But what must be there, right, undergirding real experience, the experience people actually have. And just to sort of sense where this is going, if you have the encounter, you have an encounter, and in that encounter, you sense something, he says, that can only be sensed. Right? You sense something that can't be brought in categories, You sense something that can only be sensed.
You sense something.
You sense something that can only be sensed. Remember, that's from the reading last time, right? So we sense something that can only be sensed. If we sense something that can only be sensed, then among the conditions of real experience has got to be what? Difference. Difference in itself, right? Because, right, what appears to us is not all there is. So how do we account for the fact that there are these experiences, right, of things that can only be sensed? Well, there must be more. So if we're accounting for that more, the way we account for it is by, and now then we're talking about how we begin to, this is the process of thought, right? The way we account for it is to give place to it somehow in our ontology and talk about what there is. So there's got to be more than what appears to us. And that more, right, that often gives rise to what appears to us is going to be difference. So, transcendental idealism asks the question, what are the conditions of all possible experience? That's Kant. Transcendental empiricism, what are the conditions? That's the transcendental part. Right? Not, right, what are the conditions of empirical reality? Reality as it happens. And that question, what are the conditions of reality, is the question that Deleuze is going to try to answer by giving us an ontology. Right? An ontology that now isn't simply a matter of thinking creatively, but is that. But is also a matter of being able to account for things, give us a way of thinking about things that move us outside of, right, the standard identities. Because if we stay in the standard identities, what's going to happen is, right, nothing creative will come of it. Right? There will be no novelty. Right? We will just be doing the same thing, right, over and over again. Right? There's an old New Yorker comic, right, it's a comic from the New Yorker, where and I always think of this as this sort of, so back and forth. This is the image of what narrative work is trying to undercut, and certainly Deleuze, right? It's got a bunch of people, old men, lined up by the sea, all right? And the old men sitting and staring at the sea. And then off to the side, there's another guy, old guy, like the other old guys, in a chair, right? And his son is next to him. And he explains to his son, and this is the bottom is him explaining to his son, right? He says, our people sit by the sea. He says, our people have always sat by the sea. When you're older, you'll understand. Right? Right? That's the image that Deleuze is trying to get us away from. Right? The image of we constantly back in the same thing. Right? But if we stay with the identities, if we refuse the encounter, right, and stay with the identities, we're going to be the folks that sit by the sea. Right? And what we have to do, he says, is follow the lead so that we can think otherwise. Right? We can be the people, right? Those people who don't know what everybody else knows, right? Who are worthy of the event, who take the encounter. Charlotte?
Is that kind of parallel thinking to Nietzsche's point about the forces? Or
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, of all of the Nietzsche for contemporary French thought, or recent French thought, because not even contemporary anymore. For recent French thought, right? Nietzsche was a touchstone, right? Was for Foucault, was for Deleuze, some more minor thinkers, Lyotard, Klosowski. He was a key thinker for all of them. I would argue, I mean, this is a bit controversial, I suppose, but I would argue he's the most Nietzschean of all. Deleuze is that Deleuze was the true Nietzschean in all this, right? For better or for worse, right? But I think of Deleuze as the real Nietzschean. The active force. What can be created, right? And thinking it, Charlotte, and I think this is the what you're talking about, is that dogmatic thought is reactive, right? It puts us back and saying, and the question is, how can we think actively? That might be another way to put what he's on about. Okay? Yes. Good. Right, now, let me do this. I know we're a little bit early, but I don't have more. Right? I think we've done a good bit, right? But let me...
I think what we can do here
Yeah.
is to put the break in the end.
Okay. We could, right? Right, so the idea is to take a 15-minute break, then you go home?
Yeah.
Right. Right, but what's that?
That's creative.
Yeah. but before we take a break, right, I want to ask, right, questions, thoughts. I want to make sure we feel comfortable with this, right? We're going to continue this next. For next time, just read to the end of the chapter, right? It's another 20 pages or so, right? And he talks. I didn't want to talk about this today, but you might know near the end of the reading, he talks about error as opposed to stupidity and madness, right? I actually should have quit a couple pages earlier because that discussion continues, right? So we'll do error, stupidity, madness, all that stuff, right, next week, right? But I want to make sure you feel comfortable with what's happening because everybody walked in, right? Actually, Benedict, I will ask you because you said this was harder than last time, right? First, do you feel like you're getting a sense of it?
Yes.
Does what I said sound like anything like what you read?
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
So far, so good.
Okay. Good. All right. That'll be good because it's one thing to feel like okay, I'm getting what you're saying, but I have no idea how that relates to the reading, right? It's another thing to think. Yeah, I begin to see it in the reading, right? Now that we've spent some time just lingering over it a bit, so that's okay, right? Right. And so I feel like I'm nervous to let you go, right? It's like we're getting really deep into the Deleuze thing, right? And now I let you go, and I got no control over you for the next week. Right? I mean, you could backslide. I could walk in here, and I'm going to have a bunch of Kantians on my hands, right? It could get really ugly, right? So this okay? Go ahead, please.
When I read this chapter, there was a part with some weird conjugation.
Yeah.
Memorandum.
Do you remember where?
It's in the end.
At the end of the reading?
After
Let's see.
this part.
Cogitatio natural.
His
universal.
contrasting something about sensibility or with sentiendum and
It sounds like from that, I'm not thinking of the passage, generally sentiendum would be the thing that is sensed. And the sensibility is the thing that senses it.
okay, yeah,
Maybe?
yeah, maybe.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, the sentiendum is that which is sensed, the sensibility is the thing that senses it. Yeah. Good? Okay, so we're good.
Can we,
Stem?
is it okay to ask questions?
Yes, we get to ask questions.
Okay, just after this paragraph, but no, I've got my book in the car. So
Okay.
He's talking about what he calls a sign.
Okay, where are you? Because you're now in our text, right?
Yeah, it's blah blah blah. It's just after this paragraph, after the encounter.
After the encounter. Okay, good. Yeah.
In this place, it says the object of encounter, on the other hand, really gives rise to sensibility with regard to sense. It is not a.
Wait, we're still on the same page?
Yeah, further down, just a few sentences.
Object encounter gives rise to sensibility in regard to a given sense.
And then it is not, I don't know how this word is.
Esteton, yeah, it's.
But the next thing,
okay.
it's not a quality, but a sign.
Oh yeah. Right, and the next sentence as well. It's not a quality of a sign. It's not a sensible being, but the being of the sensible.
Yeah.
Okay, that's cashing out what he said in the last sentence. In other words, to say it's not a quality is to say it's not a particular identity that we can recognize, right? A quality, brown, black, this, right? Those would be qualities, right? But a sign, it's a sign that there's more than what it is, right? That we can put in our sensibility. That's why he says it's not a sensible being, right? That would be it's not a quality, not a sensible being, right? But the being of the sensible, right? The thing that would be, and that's we'll see the virtual, the different. That's coiled inside the sensible. So what is it a sign? It's a sign of the more, a sign of something more. Are we good? Okay, that's it. That was easy. Good.
But that's what you encounter.
Yes. Well, be a little careful. You would sense something, right? Right. You don't encounter it as a sign, right? You sense something, right? That's something you sense. If you take it up, it becomes a sign of something else. If you don't ignore it, right? So you don't sense something as a sign, but the thing you sense is a sign that there's something more. You see what I mean? In other words, you don't sense it. It doesn't appear to you as a sign. It just appears to you as this dislocation, right? And that dislocation is itself a sign that there's something more. Okay?
Could you make an example? How could this be like more? In what way could we encounter something that would be like a sign, which is pointing to?
Okay. Yeah. No, yeah. Go back to the therapy example, right? With Anna, right? So you're doing therapy. The person keeps denying it. Something, right? And this is a sign to you. There's something more, but I don't know what it is. That's what it means as a sign, right? Like this thing I can't assimilate is now a sign to me, right? That there's something more that I just don't know how to. I can't fit it in anywhere, right? That's the way in which it's a sign, right? We put it this way: it's a sign. It signals to me. It signifies to me that there's something more, right? Than what I was. There's something more than was in my categories. Good? Yes? I feel like there's more, I feel like you're still... I don't understand. I feel like there's still something more.
No, yeah, it's okay.
Okay.
I think that there's a sign. There's a sign that there's something more.
Yeah, that's what it seems like. There's, right? I'm trying to give him signs of moreness. Right. Okay. Good? Are we good? So we're good for next week? And then we'll pick it up next week. Good.
I just want to let you know that next week I'm at Crete. So my interns and I will not be here. But I will find out, and I will ask you to help each other getting some water, bring it up here, and also to organize the room for this encounter. And perhaps I could ask Matthias to do the camera thing here. Do you think that?
I have to learn before.
Okay, I'll teach you. Okay. Otherwise, I will ask Miss to teach you.
Yeah.
But if you come next time, please.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, that would be great. Thank you.
Nice doesn't even have to teach him.
Yep.
I mean, Nice just shows up and it works.
No, he does, yeah.
Isn't that right?
Yeah, that's right, yeah. It's magic.